Did you see my note that Brianna wasn't going to make
Okay, we're live.
It's good to hear that you're live. Do we need to give Dan a chance to run to his office now? Is that what we're doing?
I think he may or may not be running the flag. I'm not sure and where from, but I think you can start because there's enough fluff.
Sorry?
Sorry. He has time.
I call the City of Wilsonville Planning Commission meeting of May 12th, 2021 to order. Please do the roll call. Ms. Vineyard?
Chair Cameron Vespa.
Here.
Ron Haberlein.
Here.
Sherry Greenfield.
Here.
Olive Gallagher. Jennifer Willard.
Here.
Aaron Woods.
Here.
And we understand Brianna Tusinski will be absent. Thank you.
Yes. Commissioner Tuzinski had a family emergency. Now we will all rise for the recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance led by the staff.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag
of the
United States of America
and to
the republic which is
For which it stands,
one
one nation, under God,
God,
indivisible,
with
with liberty and justice for all.
for all. Not totally in sync.
You need more practice.
Now I need to put my faculties back in. Excellent. Citizens' input. I will read the statement. This is the time that citizens have the opportunity to address the Planning Commission regarding any item that is not already scheduled for a formal public hearing tonight, and we don't have any public hearings tonight. Therefore, if any member of the audience, either here in City Hall or via Zoom, would like to speak about any work session item or any other matter of concern, please raise your hand or send a message to the recorder using the Zoom chat function so that we may hear from you now. Do we have any takers?
I do not believe so. We don't have anybody here at City Hall.
Okay.
Tammy, do we have anyone on the Zoom?
Tammy is muted.
There are no citizens waiting, no.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We did receive a written comment that all the commissioners got an email from Tammy a couple of days ago, I think. And that, Ms. Bachel, that's part of the record, yes?
Correct, it will be.
Okay. Does the commission have any questions about that letter, or is this not a good time to bring it up? It doesn't look like anybody has
It's on your work
anything.
session item for tonight, so maybe if you have questions on that or things that would impact how you make the decision, like if you want staff to bring back more information or context on it. I know that staff met with the individual as well, so we might be able to answer some questions in that regard. So I would say maybe wait for that work session item if there are things about it that mean you have questions about the topic at hand.
Very good. Next is the consideration of April 14th Planning Commission meeting minutes.
Excuse me, Chair.
Yes.
I just want to note for the record that Olive Gallagher is here. She is present.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Minutes were distributed as part of the packet. Are there any corrections to the minutes? I don't see anybody raising hands. Minutes approved as submitted. then we move on to our work session item on middle housing. Ms. Bachel, do you want to introduce the subject and the staff presenting?
Yeah, I would be happy to. Thank you, Chair Musbah, Commissioners. This subject and this project hardly needs introduction at this point. You've seen it multiple times over the past calendar year. As you're all aware, this project stems from statewide legislative changes around middle housing and residential zoning all across the state. So to some degree, state rules essentially mandate that we look at our code and make amendments. You also know that in that same time frame, we adopted the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan, which provides guidance at the city level for us in pursuing strategies and policies that help to further equitable housing. So we have a couple different things that are guiding this work. So I always like to provide that reminder for those at home and also you in thinking about the different recommendations that staff bring in front of you. So tonight, you're going to start to see things really start to crystallize and solidify in your packet. I know when I looked at it and actually saw the strike-through draft of code changes, it feels like, wow, okay, we've done a lot of work because we're at this point. So I want to say thank you for that, and also stick with us because I also know that when we actually start seeing it drafted in that manner, we get into the nitty-gritty of it as well. So thank you, and please stick with us. We're almost there. I know the project's working hard. The project team is working hard in bringing you these changes over tonight as well as next month in an effort to bring forth a package for you in late summer, early fall to get us across that line and into adoption so we can move forward with some of our other housing policy efforts. So without further ado, I will introduce Daniel Pauley, Planning Manager. He's the project lead for this project. He'll introduce the consultant team with him tonight. As you saw in your packet, he's done a really good job of organizing the different topics and categories. There's a lot of content. I'm getting the thumbs up from Commissioner Greenfield, so yes, I was happy to see that organization as well. It helped me to wrap my head around everything that's in front of us. So thank you, and Dan, go ahead and take it away.
It's clear Dan has not seen the sun in a while from the work that has gone into this.
Yes, I have been in City Hall, in City Hall more than out in the sun this week for sure. So, well, thanks again for showing up for another work session on this item. And I echo Miranda in that really we see things coming together at this point and look forward to discussing this with you. With me tonight, again, is Joe Dills and Kate Rogers with Angelo Planning Group, and they've done some really hard work and been a great support. I really appreciate the work they've done and the knowledge and experience they've brought to the table to help this project move along successfully. I will note, Kate will share the presentation here in a minute, but as we do that, we're covering a lot of things. Oftentimes in the past when we do these little code edits, we're going through line by line. That's not how we're able to do this. So we'll talk about general concepts and give you overview. What I'd recommend is that in the discussion tonight that we focus on items that would benefit from the discussion of the group. If you have smaller edits or comments, as some of you have already done, I'd encourage you to either go in the PDF, make comments, send that to us, or if any of you would like a Word version, we can get that to you if that's a more friendly version for you to go through and make comments, and then we can respond to that as the project team and incorporate those as we move forward, because we can't talk about every line of this in a time that would allow us still to see some sunshine tonight. So with that, Kate, can you go ahead and share the presentation?
Sure, I'll get that started.
Thank you. So go ahead, next slide. So really the topics for tonight, as you've seen in your staff report, is talking about the draft code and plan updates. Really a focus on what we call the category 1 and 2, which are, there's not a lot of options, things that came out of the audit that needed to change in order to comply with the new state statutes. That's really the focus of these. At the same time, there's some things that are either have some discretion on the city level or are kind of related things or other things that we want to fix while we're under the hood of the code that we've already discussed with you and feel there's kind of a strong support of. So we've brought those items back and how they look codified as well. Also, as a next step, we're sharing tonight are some results from the online survey, which occurred in April, and really getting your feedback on what staff, kind of the takeaways from that and how we feel that the next steps in incorporating that into this body of work. And finally, we'll revisit this question that we've talked about for a few work sessions now about Frog Pond West and what, if any, percentage requirement may be appropriate out there. So next slide, please, Kate. And before going into this, I also want to mention that, the next work sessions we'll get into really the category 3, we call it, which particularly siting and design standards, some details of that, particularly as they apply in Frog Pond and some options there. We'll also get into some of the parking policy that we've wrapped into this work in a follow-up to a council goal. But always want to reiterate, in addition to, I think this group understands what middle housing is, but again, we're talking about 2 to 3 units on a single lot, or up to 4 generally, or units that are on their own lot but attached. That's really what we're talking about when we're talking about middle housing this evening. So we're looking at the HB 2001 compliance, the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan, and really trying to make these standards usable and related to reality on the ground and how it's going to work for developers and residents over the years. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Kate. We've talked about this, but here's a nice color key. Again, category 1 is the direct requirements. Category 2 are also requirements, but it's not a direct requirement. It's more, you need to do it in order to make what is directly required feasible. And category 3, more local feasibility, and then the technical updates, not necessarily related to compliance. And get used to these colors. I hope you like these colors because they're a key part of helping navigate this code and plan language. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. We've covered the future work sessions. Particularly, there'll be continued to be a focus on Frog Pond West, which I want to reiterate why that is. I mean, the city is much broader than Frog Pond West, but most of the city is pretty straightforward, and we have those that's before you tonight. There's a few additional design standards we'll talk about, but for the most part, there's not a lot of options, if you would. Willowbog, similarly, there's not a lot of options. There's a couple changes that are really in the category 1 or 2. And then Old Town, we've already talked about. We'll still do another neighborhood meeting there, but we feel that work is coming together consistent with the discussions we've had so far. So really, a lot of the focus is still ironing out what's happening in Frog Pond West, which is substantial because it's undeveloped land where there is the greatest potential of middle housing really within areas that are currently under our control as a city. So next slide, and with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kate, who will walk us through the updates that we're dealing with tonight. And again, I really appreciate the work that she's done along with Joe and the rest of the team and sub-consultants to get us to this point.
All right. Thanks so much, Dan, for that intro, and good evening, commissioners. So as Dan mentioned, we're going to talk mostly about the Category 1 and 2 updates, although you'll see in your packet there are some of those blue and green colors as well. But yeah, mostly focusing on the sort of pinkish and yellowish colors today. And these are changes to the development code as well as comprehensive plan, master plans, and the Old Town Neighborhood Plan. And this is reiterating what Dan has already said, but these are updates that are mostly updates that are either directly or indirectly required for compliance with House Bill 2001 in areas where the city doesn't have as much flexibility. So there aren't a lot of sort of major decisions to be made in these topic areas. But, that's not to say that these code amendments that you've seen in your packet are fully baked at this point. There's obviously still room to make changes and tweaks based on your input and additional community input. So the goal for tonight is to cover a really large packet in about, I think, 10 or 15 minutes and give a really general kind of broad overview of the proposed changes. Just make sure you kind of understand the issues and have the opportunity to ask questions and, suggest topics that need further discussion. And so the main drivers of these changes, as you see on your slide, are defining the terms for middle housing, make sure those are clearly defined, establishing middle housing as an allowed use in all residential zones, updating the review process for middle housing, incorporating density exemptions, updating the siting and design standards based on specific limits set by the state rules, updating the status of previous planned development approvals, and referencing recent housing policy updates mostly in the plan documents. So first we're going to talk about middle housing terms. So these are mostly updates to the definitions section of the Wilsonville Code, but these terms are used throughout the code, of course. So you'll see those changes reflected throughout your packet. So recognizing middle housing as a separate class of housing that kind of falls in between single-family and multifamily housing requires some changes to the way these terms are defined. So this includes things like separating triplexes and quadplexes from the definition of multifamily and creating separate definitions for those two types of housing. And also adding kind of parallel definitions for the detached versions of triplexes and quadplexes and duplexes. And we're calling those 2-unit, 3-unit, and 4-unit cluster housing and not referring to them as detached plexes. Adding a new definition for cottage cluster, which has a very specific definition in House Bill 2001 and the state rules. Updating existing terms to make sure those are consistent with the state law and just making sure those are really well differentiated and very clear. So updating the duplex definition and townhouse definition for that reason. And then also adding some secondary terms, things like common courtyard, which is used specifically in the cottage cluster standards, making sure those terms are well defined. And then this isn't sort of part of the House Bill 2001 updates, but replacing the term family with household. And the purpose of that is to reflect different living arrangements that don't necessarily meet the sort of traditional definition of family, but could be considered a household for the sake of defining what is a dwelling unit. So you'll see that reflected in your packet as well. Next, we are establishing middle housing as an allowed use in all the residential zones. So that means adding middle housing types to the list of permitted uses for each of these zones listed on your screen. So the R zone, the new Old Town residential zone, which is sort of based on the R zone, all the planned development residential zones or PDR zones, the village zone for Villebois, and the RN zone, which implements the Frog Pond master plan. And that one you'll notice is not included in your packet. And the reason we excluded that for now is just because a lot of the changes that are happening in the Frog Pond or in the RN zone and in the Frog Pond West master plan are kind of more in the category 3 topic area. So those are things where sort of bigger decisions need to be made and there's more flexibility in terms of how the city complies with House Bill 2001. So you'll see those at the next work session. Next, we need to update the review process for middle housing. So according to state law, cities have to subject middle housing to the same review process applies to detached single-family housing. So currently, single-family and two-family dwellings, or duplexes, are subject to Class 1 ministerial review, which is essentially a building permit review that's done without notice to neighboring property owners, and the decision is made by staff, by the planning director. So the updates apply this Class 1 review sort of building permit process to all middle housing types, and also clarify that middle housing, like detached single-family housing, is not subject to site design review, because under the current code, certain middle housing types, like triplexes and fourplex or quadplexes, would have to go through site design review because they're considered multifamily today. But multifamily housing, which would have 5 or more units, would continue to go through site design review. And that those changes are reflected in a couple sections of the code. And then another key provision of the state rules is that cities have to exempt duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and cottage clusters, so basically everything but townhouses, from density maximums. So for these middle housing types, it won't be sort of dwelling units per acre that will control density, but the minimum lot size standards will control density. For townhouses, the state rules do allow density to be limited, but cities have to allow at least 4 times the allowed density for detached single-family dwellings, or 25 units per net acre, whichever is less. So the draft amendments incorporate these exemptions and special provisions in various places within the various sections of the code, as well as a comprehensive plan to acknowledge that there are sort of special provisions for middle housing. So we wanted to give an example of how the townhouse density regulations would play out, specifically in the PDR zones, just as an example. So as you can see in this table here, again, it's either 4 times the single family density or 25 units per acre, whichever is less. So for the lower density PDR zones, so that's PDR 1 through 3, the maximum density for townhouses will be 4 times the density for single family. But then for the higher end of the density scale, for the PDR 4 through PDR 6 zones, 4 times the density for single family would be higher than 25 units per acre. So for those zones, the recommendation is to cap density for townhouses at 25 units per acre. So that kind of shows you how that will end up working in the code. And then for minimum lot size, the standards required for compliance with the administrative rules really drive the recommendations for changes to minimum lot size. So as you see here in the green column of the table, that shows the minimum compliance with the administrative rules for each middle housing type. That's the kind of minimum standard. So then the 2 blue columns to the right of that show examples of how those minimum lot sizes have been updated in the PDR 2 and PDR 4, just to give 2 different examples of how that works. So in PDR 2, the minimum lot size for a single family home, so kind of the current standard for minimum lot size, is 7,000 square feet. So according to the rules, the city can apply that same minimum lot size to all middle housing types other than townhouses. For townhouses, the minimum lot size can't exceed 1,500 square feet. And then in the PDR 4 zone, which has a much smaller minimum lot size for single family of 3,000 square feet, the city does have to apply that same standard to duplexes. So a duplex would also have to be allowed on a 3,000 square foot lot, and as well as a 2-unit cluster, so the sort of detached version of that. For triplexes, the city can require up to 5,000 square feet minimum lot size. And then for quadplexes and cottage clusters, the city can require no more than 7,000 square feet. So those are the recommendations kind of going with what the state allows to be done. And then again, for townhouses, the minimum lot size can't exceed 1,500 square feet. So hopefully that's making sense. In terms of other siting standards, sort of generally speaking, the state rules require cities to apply the same siting standards or development standards to middle housing as apply to single-family housing. So things like maximum height, setbacks, generally speaking, you're kind of applying the same standards across the board. But there are some specific rules with limitations for certain standards, for certain housing types that have been incorporated into the draft code amendments. So those include things like for triplexes, quadplexes, and townhouses, cities need to allow at least 2 stories. So those can't be limited to less than 2 stories. Limiting setbacks for cottage clusters specifically to no more than 10 feet. So say if the city has a front setback of 15 feet from all other development, for cottage clusters, that would need to be reduced to 10 feet. Minimum lot width and frontage for townhouses can't be any higher than 20 feet. And cottage clusters must be exempt from lot coverage maximums. But lot coverage maximums can apply to any other middle housing type. So you'll see all these specific limitations reflected in the draft changes. We wanted to take a little closer look at lot coverage standards in the R zone, the residential zone, because this is one area where the amendments aren't strictly required for compliance with HB 2001, but they are necessary to make middle housing feasible to build. So those would fall into the sort of category 2 yellow color-coded category. So the current maximum lot coverage in the R zone is only 30%, which is pretty limiting. It's a pretty limiting standard for a building footprint, especially when you think about, more than one dwelling unit. And that poses a pretty significant barrier to middle housing development, especially on smaller lots. So the recommendation is to revise the lot coverage standard for all development, not just middle housing, but for all development in the R zone to make development more feasible. And the standard would kind of scale up or down based on the actual lot size. So as you can see in the table here, the maximum coverage on larger lots is lower, and then it kind of scales up based on decreases in lot sizes. So for large lots with 20,000 square feet or more, the maximum lot coverage would be 25%, so it would be the lowest. But for lots with 7,000 square feet or less, the maximum lot coverage goes all the way up to 60%. So hopefully that will make middle housing, more possible to build.
And if I can add here, Kate, so these are based on the same standards that apply in PDR and the RN zone. So the idea is that regardless of the zone, a lot of the same size throughout the city would have the same allowed lot coverage. As if you recall, since I know it's a fond memory for all of you when we did our residential code update for PDR last year, that this was also something we did is update the lot coverage for the PDR zone to the modern standard of the RN zone. So this continues that trend, which really is necessary to make changes to a lot of these lots feasible, because once you get down to that 25-30%, generally you'll see every structure built to the maximum lot coverage.
Thanks, Dan, for that clarification. Okay, shifting gears to talk about the Old Town design standards. So these design standards currently apply to single-family homes and duplexes in the Old Town neighborhood, and they're intended to ensure that new development reflects the architectural heritage and the styles that are sort of prevalent in the Old Town neighborhood. But now that middle housing will be permitted in Old Town, the design book needs to be updated to accommodate those additional housing types, but also some of the standards need to be modified to comply with state law. So according to the administrative rules, cities can apply the same design standards to middle housing that apply to single-family dwellings. But there are some limitations on how those design standards can be scaled up for multiple units. And also the standards need to be clear and objective, which is not just a standard for middle housing, but is a general state requirement for housing regulations. So the proposed changes to the Old Town Design Book are really the minimum changes needed for compliance, not trying to, totally rewrite the standards, but just make sure middle housing is accommodated and that the regulations comply. So one example of a change that you'll see in your packet is that the design book currently requires duplexes must appear indistinguishable from single-family houses. So for one thing, this effectively applies a more restrictive standard to middle housing, currently to duplexes, and potentially, if it were applied to other middle housing types, that would be more strict than just a single-family house, because you're essentially requiring a housing type with multiple units to appear as if it only was one unit. So we don't think that it complies with state rules, and we also, I would argue that it's maybe not fully clear and objective, because it would probably require some discretion to interpret that standard. So we've essentially deleted that standard from the book, and we're trying to consider some additional potential standards that would work to promote good design outcomes for middle housing in Old Town, kind of in keeping with the intent of the current book, but with standards that would comply with state rules. So we haven't included those sort of additional standards in this current draft, but I think we'll bring those forward at the next session where we're focusing more on siting and design standards. And then sticking kind of with the Old Town theme, we've also made some updates to the Old Town neighborhood plan. And these changes they're recommended. They're not necessarily required for legal compliance with state law, but I think they would be helpful to ensure the plan continues to be a useful document going forward and contributes to the larger goal of increasing opportunities for middle housing and equitable housing in the city. So some of the updates to the land use chapter of the Old Town plan include just kind of summarizing some of the recent changes to state law to show why some of the revisions to the neighborhood plan were required or helpful. Updating some of the policy recommendations to reflect recent changes in ownership and development plans for specific lots, because there are sort of specific recommendations that apply to specific properties, and the sort of status of some of those properties has changed over time. Updating the recommendations to reflect proposed changes to the R zone and the RAH zones that applies in Old Town, and also updating some of the discussion of accessory dwelling units to reflect some of the recent code changes as well as additional proposed code changes that are needed for state law compliance. And then I think this is my last slide. Wanted to touch on Villebois because as Dan mentioned, we've had a lot of discussion of Frog Pond, but these middle housing requirements do apply in Villebois as well. But Villebois doesn't have quite the same issues as Frog Pond, partially because it's already built out for the most part, and also because the planned density based on the master plan exceeds 10 units per acre. So that kind of exceeds that threshold that we've been talking about of 8 dwelling units per acre that would qualify the area for the special master plan community provisions in the state rules. So because Villebois does exceed that threshold and qualifies for those special provisions, the initial build-out in Villebois can essentially continue as planned, except that duplexes do need to be allowed everywhere single-family homes are permitted. So for the most part, the amendments to the master plan and the code are needed to allow middle housing in the future for future infill or redevelopment. So specifically, updates to the village zone or V zone reflect that requirement to allow duplexes on any remaining single-family lots during the initial build-out phase, and then the allowance for other middle housing types to be developed after the lots are already initially developed. And then also reflecting some of the state rules limiting siting and design standards that we talked about earlier. All right, so I guess I'm going to pause here and see if folks have any questions or comments.
Commission, any questions?
So, yes, I do, Chair Mesbah.
Go ahead.
One of the things that I saw in the staff report, which was an awesome 251-page read, was some of the discussion around recommended middle housing requirements in Frog Pond. Are we discussing that here in this meeting, or didn't want to start talking about it too soon? So I was going to ask that question.
Yes, we are. We're going to talk after this. We're going to talk about the survey, and then lastly, we'll revisit that percentage.
Okay, great. I will hold until then.
Anybody else? I don't see anybody hands up. I guess we'll proceed.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And again, I reiterate, I know we've already had some comments come through, and that's appreciated, but added eyes on this is helpful. So as you're able to look through this and have any comments, especially kind of fine-grained comments or edits, please just send those to me via email. And again, if you want a Word version, let us know, and we're happy to get that to you. So next, as mentioned, I want to talk about the survey that we did last month. We ended up with 86 responses from a variety of folks. We did also have it in Spanish. There wasn't as much response to that survey, but we got a few, which provided some additional insight. The survey was primarily visual preference in nature, with a couple additional questions that weren't visual preference. And really the focus of the survey was it wasn't wide open. We really tried to tailor it to kind of outstanding questions we had for this project, specifically about siting and design standards, as well as the connected parking questions that are important part of the siting standards, but also follow up on a council goal more broadly. So I want to walk you through some of the main takeaways that we saw as a project team and describe the direction that we feel we should take based on that. And once I go through these, let's pause, and I'd welcome any feedback if you think the project team's understanding this correctly, and if you concur that that would be the direction to go as we continue to develop siting and design and parking standards. Next slide, please. So first of all, let's talk about adjacency. So rules of adjacency was something that we first used in the city, to my knowledge, in Villebois, and a version of those also came through, not as detailed into Frog Pond. And so that's something that's kind of become part of our residential regulations, and from staff's view, they've been fairly successful. And so we wanted to look at what type of rules of adjacency make sense more broadly as it relates to middle housing, but also keep in mind that since we'd be applying it to middle housing, it also need to apply for detached single family as well. So we really did this to test both the detached type adjacency as well as attached adjacency. You'll see that, this first picture here, they're essentially mirror images of the same floor plan, but just flipped with slightly different colors. And you got, overall, a similar response. It was more positive response, but not by much, by similar cottages next to each other that have completely different kind of facades. But at the same time, where you have the same facade, the same color, that did not get a positive response. So in terms of detached products, really what we're seeing is rules of adjacency is something that should be done, that we should consider incorporate more broadly into the code. However, it doesn't have to be that severe. It may be as simple as different colors or flipping the facade, just doing something to differentiate so it's not just a mirror image right next to each other with no variation. So leaning towards doing it, but keeping it pretty simple is where we're thinking in terms of the detached product. Kind of similar results when we start looking at the attached variation of units in an attached unit. We saw where things were kind of hodgepodge, that wasn't really desired, but where it was, the example with kind of the tannish buildings in Villebois here is it's the same color across the facade, but there's variations of, a shed versus a gabled bump out, and that variation alone adds a lot of visual interest and is a successful element to kind of break up and add variety. On the other hand, where people also like this other one that's the red and greens, is they're mirror floor plans next to each other, but there's some articulation of the facade, and there's variation in materials as well as color. So just that slight variation between hardy board versus hardy shake, as well as some variation in color, got the same response of liking it approximately as having more extreme variation in the architecture. So that kind of told us you don't have to go too far to get that, to have enough variety, but still variety in terms of not having the same thing next to each other is something that should be encouraged in our design standards. Next slide. One of the big questions we've had is how much, we talked about this in Old Town, and also it's come up in public input, how much should middle housing be required to look like single-family detached? Certainly, as you can see here, we did see the examples that looked most like single-family had the highest positive responses, which wasn't unexpected. The lowest responses were things that were more hodgepodge, that maybe had completely different architectures and just happened to have a common wall, or things that kind of bumped out and just didn't seem related architecturally, just the fact that they were attached. However, we did get positive enough response on things like you see in the lower corner, kind of the tannish building, where it's repetitive, it's clear, it's different units, but there's a high quality of architecture, and the units relate well to each other architecturally. That for the most part, people were okay with that. So kind of the takeaway staff said, anything we can do to encourage kind of the uniform look in terms of looking like a single family, that's good, but we don't need to prohibit something such as this unit that's tan, where it's architecture that works together, even though the different units are articulated. So kind of that high quality architecture that works together and relates to each other is kind of the vital piece, more than having it look like a single family home. Though some standards that encourage that single family look wouldn't be a bad thing either. So next slide. We also looked at survey results about driveways. As you're adding more units, there's going to be more paved surfaces for parking and such, and how is that treated? Because that's an important part of the urban design. We found certainly the separated driveways, such as you see at the top, got good result, positive feedback for the most part, to be it just a simple kind of planter strip between two driveways or driveways that are on kind of the opposite extreme of two detached units. You see, I mean, a similar quality of home just below on the lower line where there's not a separated driveway. That did get less, especially strongly like responses. And then oftentimes the ones that are truly shared, where that still will be necessary at some point, that wasn't the preferred approach that we found. So based on this, we do plan on exploring where appropriate to introduce standards that would encourage or require separated driveways or breaking up of those paved surfaces. Next slide, please. Into this discussion of driveways, we wanted to introduce the idea of, okay, where do alleys play in here, where you really don't see those driveways from the street. There's strong opinions both ways on alleys out there, which I think you're all aware of. We've heard it in public forums here before. Overall, we found support for the alley idea. People like the streetscape, and I think there's a good portion of the community that are used to the idea with the amount that it's been built. Again, some people really don't like it, but based on the results from this survey, there is kind of a general support for it. So from that, what we're saying is standards that could be anything from like standards related to the width of garages, and that would encourage or lead to alley-loaded design is not a bad thing. And so alley supportive design is something that, not requiring everything be an alley-loaded product, but making standards that make the alley-loaded a desirable and feasible alternative would be a good thing. Okay, next slide, please. In all of this, as I know a number of you have heard in the past, is parking. When you start talking about adding units into a neighborhood, the parking is understandably one of the primary concerns. And however, there's a lot of, you also hear about, we want a large backyard, we want, space between us and our neighbors. Those are all amenities that, when discussed in isolation, oftentimes people are very supportive and understandably are very important amenities and features of a lot for them. So we really try to get to, okay, there's only so much lot area, land is a constrained thing, where if you can't have all of these and you have to start making trade-offs, what is most important? And really we want to see from here, where does the second car parking or the third car parking really rate in relation to other siting standards or design standards that take up land? Interesting, garage was on the top of the list. Even if it's not for parking, people like their protected storage, putting their things in from the rain, apparently. So that's understandable. I know I like my garage, even though it adds a lot of tasks to keep it clean sometimes, but that's okay. There's ample space between houses. So this idea of both 2 and 3, that, that preference, which we've heard over and over again for the detached product, and that's why we've talked about broadly allowing the detached middle housing types. That we've heard that through our focus groups with the Latinx community, as well as our other outreach, and that again came through in this survey, is that really that strong preference or prioritization of detached products. Some people are fine with the attached, and with alternatives there, everything else is met. That may be, but where there's an option, that is something that is prioritized. And even more than having a large backyard or room for a second vehicle in your driveway. So about in the middle is a large backyard. Comes similarly rated similarly to having a second car in the driveway. And then having even guest or visitor parking on your property was down from there. And then a large front yard was the lowest priority, which in putting together the survey, that large front yard, I was supposing that that'd probably land there. So that was no surprise there. So again, while we're not going to require garages, we want to make sure the standards don't inadvertently overly discourage garages. So we're going to keep an eye out for that. And then in terms of the trade-offs, should we reduce lot sizes or do some extreme things because parking, second car parking is the most important thing? It's really telling us, no, not so much. That, I mean, where it can be accommodated and standards can support it, that's good, but we don't need to really trade off all these other priorities in order to enable it. So next slide, please. So another question about parking is, we know that we're only allowed to require one parking space per unit, generally speaking here. So any way to really facilitate additional parking would mean trade-offs. You'd have to somehow incentivize a developer. I mean, the market will, where available, will tend to deliver the additional parking because it is a desired amenity by many buyers or tenants. However, when you start getting constrained land, then it may not happen. So what then other standards are people willing to trade off in order to encourage a developer to provide that a second parking space, for example? So we asked about reducing lot size. This was interesting. There were feelings both ways on this. Some people thought, yeah, parking's not important. Other people said, not so much. So and then when we talked about reducing the shared open space slightly, there's a bit more support for that. So based on this, staff's thought is keeping the status quo when it comes to reducing lot size, that again, that extra parking isn't a high enough priority for people to really just kind of give everything else up in order to enable it. However, there is enough interest out there, it seems like, this reducing open space concept to continue to explore it and bring forward some concepts for further review by the Commission and Council. So I believe that's my last survey slide, so happy to let's take a moment, and if I could get your thoughts on if you disagree with any of that direction or other insights that you got from the survey that we should consider as we move forward in developing the siting design and as well as parking standards.
And I need a little clarification. Reduce open space is to reduce park and open space allotment in order to get more parking space? Is that what that means?
Yeah, so the concept here, I didn't, for ease of, so let me explain that a bit more from what the question was. It's really, that 25% open space requirement in residential, reducing that by a bit, maybe by the area of 2 or 3 parking spaces in order to have shared neighborhood parking for guests.
Oh, okay. All right. Very good. Any questions, comments from the Commission?
Yeah, Dan, I think, I was going through the questions that I had captured from looking at all of this information, particularly, the survey, and you captured the majority of my thoughts and also here on the slides. As you saw and as we've heard, parking is important, and people want to make sure that they have that space. And, couples, if it's just 2 people in the house, there's usually a husband and a wife each have their own vehicle. So I'm just you know, everything that you said and the trade-offs here, you know, and thanks for that clarification there as well on the open space. But from what I see and from the feedback, which was very, very, very good too, I read each and every one of the comments there, and some of them were long, which told me that they felt very strongly about what they were saying. So I think you gave a pretty good overview and summary, at least on what I saw. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you. Anybody else? Was there, Dan, in visual preference surveys, I'm used to an intro to those who participate that tries to inform about the trade-offs and some of the issues and so forth, so people don't come into it with just biases without having any benefit of at least a conversation about the validity of their biases. Was this survey done with that kind of an intro, or was it just cold turkey asking questions?
So it was, and also, so a couple of things. For the most part, some of them were outliers, and we were aware of that, and, you know, and the analysis took that into consideration. But for the most part, we tried to make the options, you know, otherwise similar, except for the things that we're really trying to narrow in on. So that was that. And then it was broken down in sections where there was kind of a header that explained what we're asking them to look at, and, you know, to kind of narrow your focus on these certain aspects of the pictures rather than just in general, do you like it or do you not? What are you looking at, be it the driveway or, you know, how the different units relate to each other or how they look next to each other.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, real quick, Chair Mesbah, on the shared parking. Was there any examples or magnitude reduction in terms of you reducing the lot size by an amount, or was it just a general, do you like the idea of reducing the lot size to allow shared parking?
It was portrayed that it was a small amount. It wasn't like you're trading off half your open space. It was, I mean, we didn't offer an exact number, but it did say, I believe the exact language is like a small amount or something similar to that.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Dan, you said open space. I think Commissioner Everline was talking about lot sizes.
Yeah, the question was applicable to both. You know, if it was a significant reduction in lot size or a significant reduction in open space, that would be different than a small reduction.
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't as specific on the lot size, I guess. As staff, we kind of assume, well, if you're reducing a 4,000 square foot lot, you're not going to be reducing it that much. But maybe that didn't translate through to the public as much. So the kind of the small or a small amount language wasn't used in the lot size question.
Thank you. I don't see anybody else raising hands.
Okay. Next slide, please. So let's go back to the Frog Pond Master Plan. Again, we've been talking about that the state requirement is an allowance. But if you just allow, that doesn't mean you're going to get anything. So then you've asked us to kind of go give some more thought and detail about what would be an appropriate percentage potentially to require. So next slide, please. So as we looked at this and thought about this, the thought was it should be something that does relate to the master plan, that relates to the look, feel, function, that relates to this previous work, that is not just a number pulled out of thin air, that it has a nexus to to all the work that's happened previously and the discussions that we've had. So thinking through that, really two options really boil to the surface. And again, an option still exists to just allow. But if you are going to suggest an option to require a certain amount, 10% is the first one we think about. And initially there is that too low? So we ran some numbers and see really what that looks like in considering the amount of land and the amount of lots that are available. And first of all, why 10%? 10% is the number that was identified in the master plan, the 2017 master plan, as an appropriate number to require duplexes in the small lot single family. So there's some existing base understanding that 10% is enough, is not so much that it's going to drastically change the look feel of a neighborhood, that it's going to introduce some variety, but that variety can be incorporated into a neighborhood that substantially keeps the same look, feel, and function. And so looking at that, rather than just 10% of the larger small lot subdistricts, taking that and applying it across all the subdistricts that remain for development, really you're looking at 35 to 55 units. And I'll come back and explain a bit of that range as concisely as I can here in a minute. The other option would be that really has a nexus and a connection is the 15%. It's similar and it's enough of a bump that it adds another option. And really what that reflects is the whole reason we're doing this. And it goes back to the fact that the city has decided to go down this path of compliance by increasing the overall density of the Frog Pond West Master Plan in lieu of just allowing middle housing everywhere by default in Frog Pond West. And the commission and the council agree that really that should come in the form of middle housing, that increase. And what this 15% represents is if you take that increase and apply it evenly, kind of spread it like frosting evenly across the whole master plan. As you cut the cake of those, take the pieces of those various sub-districts, that is kind of the even amount of frosting that belongs to that sub-district. So it's the it's the word I'm looking for besides frosting. So yeah, so I hope that makes sense. The word's not coming to me. And many of you know I'm at a loss of words sometimes in these presentations. And sometimes I can't pronounce things either. So the 15% then really translates into that percentage spread evenly across the whole master plan, and those remaining sub-districts take their fair share of that percentage as if it were spread across the master plan.
Before you go ahead, Dan, let me repeat what I thought you said, and you tell me if I understood it right. 15% is the average increase if applied throughout the neighborhood. However, because some of it is already built, that average applied to what remains would be 65 to 85 units. Is that right?
Right.
Okay. So I now understand it. I don't know whether that clarified it for the rest of you.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure. So if you were to apply a 10% over the entire area, that results in 65 to 85 units, which is 15% of the remaining area. Is that?
No, the math's not that easy, Rob.
All right.
Sorry.
Okay.
So if you look at the increase, which is the 138 units, it roughly is the number that we're using. if you apply that, if you relate that to the undeveloped area, which is about half of Frog Pond West, you're looking at upwards of a 50% increase in units. If you even that out or spread it evenly across all of Frog Pond, which is the idea we're trying to do is average that increase across the entirety of the master plan area, you're more looking at about 25% increase in density spread across the whole master plan. So what you're then trying to do is bump up each subdistrict by that evenly by that 25%. So the 15% density bonus equals about a 25% increase in density.
Okay, I think I understand now.
And just real briefly what the range represents, because we'll get into this in the other, is some assumptions about the amount of duplexes and triplexes or 2 or 3 unit development. Because there's this relationship, the more, the assumption is the amount of lots is a constant across these options. And so that lot could be a duplex or a triplex or a single family home. So if you're trying to implement a required amount of middle housing, the more of those that are triplexes leaves you more lots left over for single family. So that difference then between, let's say, 65 and 85, that 20 difference is actually additional single family units mostly that are enabled by putting more units on fewer lots to meet the middle housing requirement, versus the lower number assumes that it's all 2-unit middle housing development with maybe a triplex here and there to make up for an odd number. Does that make sense?
I think so.
But that's promising then, if you think it might make sense. So, because there's this, as you add middle housing, you reduce the amount of lots available for single family. And to maximize units, the developer is going to end up adding probably more than the minimum typically, so they can maximize the minimum amount of, let me step back here. So you have, let's make it simple, you have 10 lots, and the code says your the maximum amount of single family that you can currently build is 10 because you have 10 lots. If you put, and let's say you're required 6 middle housing units as a bonus. So if you put those 6 on 2 lots, then you get more single family, or if you put those 6 across 3 lots, you get less single family. And the math's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's kind of the idea. And I'll leave it at that because I don't want to spend too much time explaining this math tonight. I'm happy to answer any clarification questions on that. Otherwise, I'm not going to try to draw a picture of the spreadsheet too much.
Wise man. Any other questions? See, it's clear to everybody, Dan. You did a bang-up job.
So I'm interested then what the commission's preference is, 10 or 15%, or if you still have more questions to get more clarification before making selecting A, B, or C here.
So,
Commissioner Woods, go ahead.
yeah, so Dan, you're asking us to choose either 10 or 15%. Do we have to choose either?
really, I mean, I guess you could choose the match the allowed, but from my understanding, no one's leaning towards that one. So really the option would be not do anything, just stick with the allowance and the current code. 10% or 15% would really be the three options I'd be interested in the commissioner's preferences on, or say, I still don't know, I need more information. And what sort of additional information you would need. And Joe, I don't know if you have any more color commentary that, or maybe restating things a little differently that may add clarity for folks.
Maybe just a little bit of a rephrase, but I think you laid it out here in your last couple of sentences. The fundamental policy choice here is, should there be a middle housing requirement in the remaining lands of Frog Pond West? Just to make it simple. We know if we leave the code alone, there will be just very little. There'll be 4 additional units that would be required. And and of course there will be the allowance, so there's the unknown as to whether there would be any middle housing built at all. Based on conversations with the development community, patterns we've seen, we have reason to doubt that there would be much built. So hence the question of should there be a requirement? The other driver for that, of course, is the city's equitable housing strategy. Should it be applied in some measure for the remaining lands of Frog Pond West? So I would say that is the fundamental question to answer in your minds. And if you lean towards yes, it's a land supply we should use for some middle housing, then the staff has put together what we think is relatively modest metrics, numbers to go along with that, trying to attach to what was the percentages in the original concept. Thank you for that. Should I go round robin and call on people? Why don't you start, Ron?
Okay, great. My preference is 15%. I think it is a reasonable increase. It's not too large, but it's still large enough to be impactful to the city and its attempt in equitable housing.
And is that the end of your remarks?
That's it.
Okay.
I'm good.
Good. Ms. Gallagher.
I think I'm going to go towards the 10%.
Do you want to expound on that, or will you just...
That's it.
Okay.
Less is more.
Commissioner Woods.
Yeah, I like the 10% as well. I think, the 35 to 55 units additional, I think is in my opinion, a good sweet spot there. So yeah, I like the 10%.
Who am I missing? Commissioner Greenfield.
Yes, I'm still concerned about doing our best to keep faith with the original bargain we had in Master Planning West. And I think that 10% comes closest to that.
So help me with that a little bit, Commissioner Greenfield. Is this an opportunity to revisit that bargain because the state is asking the city to look at, updating and so forth? Or is this because it's just land that hasn't been developed yet, and it's an opportunity that needs to be captured, so to speak, with our equitable housing plan.
Okay, I think it is good faith in two directions. It's good faith toward the community that accepted the compromise before, and it's good faith in keeping with the intention of the state. I think that it's reaching out in both directions at once and without giving everything to either.
Okay. I think I understand. What you're saying is doing nothing, which probably won't add anything, is not keeping with the spirit of the state regulations. It's just, paying lip service.
Goals. We're talking about state goals here.
Okay, thank you for that. Commissioner Willard.
I really value the planning process, and I feel that if we deviate too much from the strong planning work that was already done for this community, that it will erode trust in the planning process. So I tend to err on the side of that I'd rather us honor the planning and do what is required by the state. And if we do more than that, I would err on the side of minimal, 10% or less, because I don't want to erode the confidence in the planning process and reduce participation in future master planning processes.
Okay.
Could I insert another consideration here?
Go ahead.
That since our master planning of West, the whole area plan for that matter, there is another element which has come to the fore, and that is being expressed in the equitable housing strategy. And I think that there is a new voice, or a voice that at least was not heard strongly in our original planning, that has become stronger in the equitable housing strategy, and I think that we need to honor that too. So it's a balancing process, and I think the 10% does our best chance of balancing the interests that we need to be responsive to.
Okay.
I think that's good feedback, especially since you were deeply involved in the planning of Frog Pond West. You were there as part of that. I was not, so I think that's a good perspective.
And I guess I'll throw mine in, as I was there as well. And, my struggle with Frog Pond West all along has been the grand compromise to push all density out of West because of strong community pushback. My fundamental question, and it's been long enough that I don't remember, is did we really hear from all of the community or the vocal part of the community? And that is what I'm not sure about. And so that's when I look at the 10 versus 15, I am erring on that side of maybe allowing a little bit more. Maybe a third option, you split the difference and we call it 12 and a half. I can get behind that. To me, we have one opportunity to do this. What do we want to do with it? As a city, what do we want to do with it? And if we want to, I won't say skate by, if we want to minimize the impact to the existing neighborhood, which I can completely understand that sentiment, because I don't want to erode the trust of the planning process either, then we go down that route. But if it all depends on priorities. Where does that priority lie? Is it equitable housing? Is it the opportunity to have that potentially more affordable housing or that diverse housing mix? Or is it maintaining what we already agreed to? And that's, in my mind, what the city needs to decide, which one's more important.
So, Commissioner, why explain to me why you think this is our one shot at this? Because the way I'm looking at it is this is Frog Pond West, and there's Frog Pond East and South still to consider, and there are going to be other future master plan communities, and so I don't know why this is the last shot.
in my mind, there's already density baked into east and south that is, they are more heavily loaded with density than west is. West is very little density. And so we have an opportunity on a very large parcel of property in the city to make a choice. Is there going to be additional urban growth boundary increases? Sure. I agree with that. But this one won't happen again. And the likelihood of it being redeveloped in the next 50 years is unlikely as well. So this piece of property, this is our opportunity to make a change if we want to.
The conversation, as I hear it, because again, I wasn't part of that planning process, I am learning about it by listening to those who have been part of it. To me, it sounds like at the time that grand bargain was had, I go back to education. There wasn't enough dialogue and education across the community so that the city as a whole can, and the community of the city as a whole, can understand what it is that it is buying into, what concept is it buying into. My own professional bias, and I call it bias, is most landowners and developers think it's theirs to develop. And it is true that it's theirs to develop. The Constitution protects that. However, it's being made possible by the city and the community of the city as a whole, and the taxpayers and everybody else who's supporting the inclusion of that land in the city. So it needs to be a decision that not only benefits those who develop and own the land, but the community as a whole. And sometimes in these confrontational grand bargains, we don't have enough time to go out to those who may not be paying attention and say, do you know what you're underwriting in this part of the city? Indirectly or directly. And if we take time to have that conversation, the outcome may be very different. That's just what my experience and history has taught me. So that's what I'm hearing from those of you who are saying this is still an opportunity. It's not completely gone. We did hear from the community on this equitable housing and how important it is for the community as a whole. And that wasn't part of the conversation at all because nobody asked those questions or listened to those comments when this grand bargain was had. So, that's a voice that was quiet at the time. And now we have heard it, and we still have an opportunity to at least acknowledge that we have heard it. That's what I'm hearing from some of you.
Can I add something?
Go ahead.
It was my initial response when I read the letter that you sent around yesterday, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And it just seems to me that we may be in a situation where we need a little bit of good PR. We need some marketing here. I think that for people who might think that our motivation to do this is based on profit rather than on a change in zoning requirements that we're trying to fulfill and do it in an honorable way, maybe that would be one of the things that we can do for the community is to have articles that are coming out, in whether it's in the Boone's Ferry, however you would like to handle it from City Hall. But it just seems to me that if our, quote, motivations are being misunderstood in terms of the decisions we're struggling with, maybe this is a good time to clarify it.
That's a very good point. It's always a good idea to clarify why some decisions are being made.
If you have people who aren't happy, you can't just let them sit there and be upset and angry and resentful. If we have a genuine ethical position that we're trying to fulfill in terms of both equality and diversity and the state law, then I think a little education here done in a very, tactful way will help people understand what we're wrestling with. That these are not decisions that are being based strictly on profit, but on trying to fulfill the needs of looking to the future and trying to figure out how to do it best for the community. And I'm not hearing that message when I'm out and about in the community. So just a suggestion.
Yeah, if I could weigh in here as well. Olive brings up a very good point from the marketing standpoint, but the visibility standpoint across the city, because I too have not seen a lot of explanation as to why. I'm just hearing not in my backyard, even though they support, or so I assume some of them support the equitable housing direction. But I think, having some clarification and, in a number of different ways, I think that might be beneficial and helping our residents, and particularly our Frog Pond West residents, understand what it is that the city is trying to do and the reasoning behind that. So I, for one, would like to see that happen.
Agreed. Anybody else wants to talk to this point?
I'll just say that you guys made some very compelling arguments, and I am seeing it differently now. So thank you for the dialogue.
Thank you for that. I hadn't said anything about what option I would go for. I would go for 10% for some of the reasons that were already mentioned. And I think I basically verbalized my reasoning. Whether or not it's going to be convincing as an ethical kind of a dilemma that I'm trying to resolve. Whether it's convincing to others, I really don't know and really don't care, actually. I just explained my thinking is all I did. So I'm in support of 10%. I think 15%, especially since Dan explained that would increase density by 25%, essentially. That's it's moving in the direction of changing the kind of texture of the community potentially. Again, these are not, the letter was mentioned. That letter is talking about affordability. These are not affordable units as we would define them, and we talked about this last time. These are going to be professional, young residents that don't need the maintenance of a detached house, and these are not apartments. These are some of the points that were in that letter to me didn't resonate with what we're doing here at all.
That's correct.
So that's where I am. I don't know if that is adequate direction for staff. Is that what you were looking for?
That was excellent. I may ask permission to replay that sometime for people. That was the most excellent discussion.
You also copyright if you replay that.
That was very articulate and appreciative. It just shows a great understanding of everything that's at play here, and really appreciative about your thoughtfulness around this. So I do think it provides the direction that staff was looking for, and good foundation of why that direction is being recommended from the commission. So thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Anything additional? That's all that we had for you this evening. So anything additional?
Kidding.
Oh.
Wow.
Great. Dinner.
Still sun outside.
Still light outside. I can take my puppy out.
You would have to climb on a tree to catch the sun now, I think.
No, sunset is actually almost 8:30.
No, it's quite sunny here still.
Very good. That's the end of the work session. You had in your packet the material from City Council's actions. Are there any questions on that from staff? If not, the next item is the PC work program. Are there any questions on that from staff? Ms. Bateshell, do you need to prime us for next meeting on stuff that's coming up?
I have to remind myself of this on the next meeting.
Is that bad? You're trying to get it out of your mind?
Middle housing is on it.
You have a break from middle housing. A slight reprieve. Wait, I thought you said you were going to have another work session, Dan.
So I'm saying that, yeah, I know that middle housing is on it. Yes. No break from middle housing until fall.
Oh.
We'll do it until you get it done.
So you'll be moving Frog Pond off of the agenda, correct?
You apparently have an old agenda, yes. Frog Pond is off that agenda.
Yeah, whatever went in the packet, I think, is old. So apologies for that.
It has Town Center streetscape plan on it.
That will be coming to you next month, as well as the annual housing report and middle housing. I believe you may also be getting the Equal Housing Action 1A. I need to check with staff on that, whether that will be on June 9th or in July. And that is, what?
It is on what you gave us.
It is on there. I need to double check because it's been very busy. So when you ask, has it been that bad, the answer is yes.
So remind us, what is Action 1A?
Yeah, so Action 1A is the transit-oriented development site at the transit center. So looking at a potential development on that property. So the action item itself is to do a development opportunity study. So that will be looking at a lot of the feasibility items, both from a market standpoint, affordable housing, financing standpoint, as well as land use compatibility, which I know has been a question that's been raised in these meetings. So that will be the purpose of the study and getting policy direction on that. So stay tuned. That will be at some point this summer.
What about the park? What about the proposed park and the bridge that we took a look at during one session?
Oh, the the I-5 bike pedestrian bridge and attached Gateway Plaza. That should be coming back to you in September. Oh. That will be at 60% design. So last time you saw it was at 30%, and in September we should have 60% design.
What we have is saying the Town Center streetscape plan will have a public hearing in July.
Let me see if I can find the updated one and share it.
How did we get the wrong one in the packet?
Yeah, this was updated in April 23rd.
It's moving quickly around here. I don't know, yeah. Anyway, we apologize.
You guys don't make many mistakes, so don't worry about it.
Okay.
I believe that the adoption is going to be in August. I think that the intent is to bring it to you in August and then City Council in September. I believe it's basically right in front of Dan, because Dan will be bringing you middle housing for adoption in September and then Council in October.
Dan doesn't go home, does he?
No.
Just lives in the office.
You see the chain? If you look closely at his right arm.
It's long enough to let him go down to the hall downstairs. Very good. This has been informative, and we look forward to all of your good work.
It's just a surprise. We want to keep you on your toes.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good. With that, unless there's anything else, somebody can move for adjournment.
I move to adjourn.
Thank you so much.
I'll second.
Wonderful. Thank you. And the sun apparently is still out there.
Take care, everyone.
Have a wonderful time.
Good evening.
Bye.
Thank you.